Hello everybody, this is Loci WayOfLoci and welcome to the No Hit Podcast. Here it is my job to interview the extraordinary people in gaming, the hitless runners who beat difficult games without taking a single hit or point of damage, speedrunners completing games in mere minutes that would normally take hours, or those who have finished games completely blindfolded, or the amazing content creators and developers out there producing the engaging and entertaining content and games that we all enjoy. Today's guest is Catalystz, that's spelled Catalystz with a Z on the end on YouTube, Twitch and Twitter. Cata is a world record speedrunner and content creator with a focus on Dark Souls and Elden Ring, has participated and showcased runs in several events including ESA, GDQ, and a 2-season winner of the Elden Ring competitive event Bingo Brawlers, and having produced many high quality and viewed YouTube videos on his channel, including breaking down glitches, strategies, and telling the story of certain speedruns. In this conversation, we go into which franchise started Cata's speedrunning journey, how he approaches creating a story or documentary style video, and we go in depth into all things glitches and skips in speedrunning, and much, much more. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Catalystz. Right, Cata, thanks very much for taking the time to come on the podcast today. I hope you're doing well, man. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
No worries at all. We're going to be going into all things speedrunning, but where else to start than in the beginning? And I thought a good one to start with, or a place to start with, would be Prince of Persia, which I believe is perhaps the game that you focused mainly into. There may be one prior, so correct me if I'm wrong. But what was the first introduction to speedrunning for Prince of Persia?
Yeah, I mean, you got that spot on. It's the first game that I ever kind of dabbled with speedruns around. And as many other fellow speedrunners, I was introduced to the concept by watching GDQ on Justin TV back in the days. One time I recall I saw Mike Uyama's run. That must have been back in like 2012, summer 2012. And I had the game on my PlayStation 2 at the time. And I was like, well, what they just did there looked super cool. So why don't I try it? And that's basically how I got into it. Tested some things and looked up forums and got a little bit more involved.
I was gonna say, what was speedrunning like back then? Because obviously nowadays it's a lot simpler. There's Discord, there's forums, there's the website, there's so many resources. What was it like back in early days of speedrunning, I guess? Well, not early days, because speedrunning has been around for ages and ages, but how was it back then?
It was mostly people playing around with the games that they enjoyed and then trying to share it on forums. Like, forums exist nowadays still, but as you outlined, most things actually kind of happen over Discord. Back then, it was a lot more distant. It was also much easier to actually retain a lot of information because you didn't have the fluff of everyday conversation, but it was mostly people sticking to the point and posting things. But at the same time, back then, it was much more difficult to actually record your footage, especially from a console. So a lot of times you ran into the situation when someone encountered a glitch and they would give just a textual description of what happened, and then people would go ahead and try to replicate it. So it was a lot more, I would say, clear, but at the same time, the information was also a lot more limited than it is today.
That stuff's a lot more quickly accessible or efficiently accessible nowadays.
Yes.
What do you say about glitches? Because we're going to be talking quite a bit later on for Dark Souls and Elden Ring, but when I was looking through some of the Prince of Persia stuff, there was stuff all the way back then, some zipline stuff. So has glitches, either speedrunning, discovering, or just using them, always been something you've been interested in?
Well, basically ever since I discovered the speedruns, yeah. The concept of trying to finish the game as fast as possible is great in its own right, but discovering glitches leads to you having to understand the game on a more fundamental level and trying to really see how the developers build it from the ground up. And that, I think, is one of the more interesting parts about speedrunning, is when you realize how a game operates, you are able to exploit its systems a lot better. And so you basically get a more of a deeper understanding of also not just the game itself, but game development process potentially. So yeah, I've always found it very fascinating.
Is there any example, like in Prince of Persia? I know the one that immediately came to mind, layman's eyes when watching through the run, was similar to the zipline from Elden Ring, being able to like zoom across the map. Obviously you've got tons of experience. Would you be able to layman explain how something like that works from like the back end?
Right, let me think about this for a second.
No worries.
So between these different games, there aren't always the same systems in play. But, for example, in the Prince of Persia Sands trilogy, that is Sands of Time, Warrior Within, Two Thrones, the rewind system works very similarly, and so it is possible to exploit it in a very similar fashion. So, for example, so-called rewind tricks exist in all three of those games. You rewind twice to roughly the same spot, and that way you can duplicate a previous action. So, for example, you can get a double jump in places where you normally can't. And once you understand how it operates, you are able to use it in the different games as well. With zipping, it's very similar as well, though again the engines differ a little bit between the Prince of Persia games, but it all comes down to trying to overload the rewind memory. And once you understand that the rewind memory isn't based on the length of the actions or time or anything like that, but rather on the number of actions, then you understand that in order to overload it as fast as possible, you just need to do tons of small inputs. So realizing these things, like in hindsight, it sounds pretty obvious that is how it would work. But when you're really there doing the groundwork, it kind of comes up step by step. And really, you only get a clearer picture with a little bit more time and a little bit more understanding.
Because imagine with a lot of these glitch finds, or at least ways to make them work in a speedrunning settings, it's not the case of perhaps looking at the code and working out how the game actually works. It's the case of manually trying things step by step, saying, okay, does this work? Does this application work? Does this work? And it's only through that trial and error process you finally find something, okay, this actually can be useful.
Yeah, most of the time. Yeah, most of the time. Because not that many games are reverse engineered to the point of being able to look into the code. We will talk about Souls a bit later. We have some insight there on the code mechanics as well, for example, into the AI and whatnot. But back then in Prince of Persia, it was very much just experimental and testing and figuring things out within the game rather than in the code.
And it wasn't just one. I think I spotted, was it at least 4 of the games you went through? So went through the entire series of games, well, not entire, but a lot of the series of games, as opposed to just jumping from one game to perhaps another speedrun.
Yeah, because a lot of the games, as I said, shared similarities within the engine. A lot of the glitches were very similar as well. So it was fairly simple to jump from one game to another and pick up the speedrun there as well.
I did want to briefly touch on some of the other games just because there was so much variety that I saw. So Outlast, Last of Us, Mirror's Edge. What was that series of time? Was that just trying to find something new, or was that, okay, I just want to try everything?
That's maybe a little bit of both, but on a deeper level, speedrunning is a lot about connections and making friends and going to marathons and hanging out with people and, doing good things for charity. And when I got into Prince of Persia speedrunning again for the second time, because the first time was in 2012, and then I basically didn't really actively participate for quite some time. When I got back to it in 2015, I got to know a group of great people that I'm still friends with to this day. And they also speedrun other games. And through them, I also got to know more people. Then I went to certain marathons and got to meet more people there. They would show me their speed games, and I would find them interested and try to pick them up. So yeah, there was quite a lot of variety in that time, and definitely something like Mirror's Edge stands out because it was such a unique speed game, and I still enjoy playing it to this day, even though I barely ever get the chance to. But yeah, I ended up with multiple games, like, for example, Dishonored, that I only speedran, but never actually did a casual playthrough of. Same with Outlast. I never played the game normally. I picked it up only as a speedrun.
That's interesting. That must have been... Did you watch your video playthrough, or as you were going through? Because imagine that was sort of a surprise on certain things that happen in the game, but not in a casual aspect.
Yeah, it's usually when you're picking up a new speedrun, you check out some of the routes, you check out some of the previous runs done already. Try to go through it, try to understand the glitches. If you have questions, you can usually ask people as well. They're more than willing to help. And for example, in Outlast's case, I also had a friend who was a very prolific speedrunner of the game already, so he was able to help me out as well.
Oh, I want to... We're going to briefly dash forward in time because I just want to link from that. So that's on pre-established games and routes and being able to learn in that way. When something like Elden Ring came out for the first time, and like say, I know we're jumping for literally 10 years or just under, but how was that as an experience learning a speedrun, or did you not even look at it as a speedrun at the very start?
Well, a lot of the times when a new game comes out, it goes through this cycle where most people play through it casually at first. They want to enjoy it, right? So I went through the same thing as well. And after that, it's routing down different games for speedruns will differ. Of course, something like From Software game is very open. Usually you have different builds, many items, different routes for required bosses. So it comes down to realizing what are the goals to beating the game, like what actually needs to be done. Like, for example, with Elden Ring, beating Malekith and beating Radabeast at the end. and then trying to find the meta ways of actually defeating or meeting those conditions, such as finding the best weapons, trying to find weapons that are accessible early, that can be upgraded, and you sort of go from there most of the time. And it becomes a big community effort. As I said, speedrunning is, I want to say, all about community. It's all about working together to break down a game and make it finishable faster. Sure, there are people that will end up having the records, but it all comes down to the community working together to really understand the game, to figure out the strategies, to break it down together. And when this happens with a big new release, there's a lot of people coming in, so a lot of people play, a lot of people have ideas, a lot of people encounter just random quirks happening, and then when all of that is shared, you kind of pour the knowledge together and come up with a route. And the routes can change very much. I remember when Elden Ring came out and I was running all Remembrances, back then with the Sword of Night and Flame, I would make a new set of splits, do a run of it one day, and then by the time that it was afternoon next day when I was going to do more attempts, there were multiple changes to the route and I had to delete like half the splits, and that kept on happening for like 2 weeks every single day. So it can be really, really, really active when a new game comes out.
God, the Sword of Night and Flame gives me flashbacks because I was mainly like the hitless scene back then, and there was like tons of research going into which was going to be the best weapon. Like the Bloodhound's Fang was like a one that was coming out on top, and then that thing came out and just was rinsing through bosses. Just flashback to that. Okay, I think we do need to go back a step because there is stuff I want to speak about in Elden Ring, but I don't want to get too deep into it because then we're going to ignore Dark Souls.
Yeah, sounds good.
So went through a bit of variety of games. So that was 2012 that you started the speed running. So with Prince of Persia, what years or when was you first introduced to Dark Souls, or was it just the speed running of Dark Souls that introduced? Because I think 2011 the game itself came out, but what was your introduction to it as a speedrunning game?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we come back to the fact that Dark Souls was another game that I didn't finish casually and started speedrunning instead, actually.
Okay.
It was late 2017, I believe, and it was just after a brief spur when I was running The Last of Us. And with The Last of Us, I generated like a solid following on Twitch as well. Like I would basically stream daily attempts and I would have like 50, 60 viewers back then. And that's pretty solid for a very random game like Last of Us. But the problem with that game was it was too repetitive. It was too long, like 2.5 hour run plus that can depend sometimes on basically some NPC quirk here and there. And so I was looking for something new. I was looking for something that could last a while. I was looking for something where there would be a community around it so that I could engage with them. And I was looking for a game that also had a following as a speedrun, right? Like that was also in my consideration. And somehow I just landed on Dark Souls because I had seen some Dark Souls runs before, but having not played the games properly, I didn't really know what was going on. And so I just immediately jumped in and I started practicing Dark Souls 1. I started making save files, right? I went over the wiki that existed back then. Still exists, just under a different name, but started to basically get into it that way. And I think I started learning in like summer 2017 and started doing attempts kind of late 2017. And it reminds me of a story. There's an out of bounds to getting to Four Kings.
Okay, yeah.
And you drop down to the arena, basically. And there's no fall damage, right? So you survive. But because I had not played the game casually, I did not equip the Covenant of Artorias. And so I kept on dropping in from out of bounds. And I was like, why do I keep dying? What am I doing wrong? Like, is my positioning off? Am I not jumping correctly? And then I realized, oh, I need to have the ring equipped. Wow.
I'm just thinking to get like the weird experience of playing through, because I mean, I guess like a general person's experience of the game is playing, getting absolutely wrecked by whichever Dark Souls you normally play, even Dark Souls 2. Imagine you get wrecked if that's your first one. Going into just the purely the speed run, did that make it a tad easier, or do you reckon there was still a big learning aspect on top of the speed run, of course?
Oh, that was a massive learning aspect. Like, I also started with routes that was mentioned on the wiki, but it wasn't really the meta anymore, which was Crapple Mage, as it is called, which basically meant full magic. And back in 2017 already, the move swap glitch was a thing, and people ran with Dragon Tooth or Black Knight Greatsword, and it was very, very different. But I started as Crapple Mage because I didn't know any better. And some of the fights, like Ornstein and Smo, with magic is so awful, and I would basically not know what I was doing. And I remember being so mad when I was practicing it. It took me like 30 minutes with a save file, so I wasn't even running back. I would basically retry the fight again and again. It took me like 30 minutes to beat them for the first time. So it was still a massive learning curve for sure.
Yeah.
And one thing that is really important to note is that you learn strats for a specific speedrun, but then if something deviates, if you are put into a different position, if you have different equipment, that doesn't carry over too well, right? Like you do not know the bosses as well in Melee, for example, if you only practice ranged.
Yeah.
So that is something that I had to deal with later on as well.
So what was your approach to learning back then, like learning a speedrunning route and improving one? And is that different to how you approach it now when you've obviously done world record speedruns? Is there a difference how you did it then, or any improvements you've do if you would approach a new route now?
I think that philosophy kind of still stays the same. I think because I had such massive experience already in speedrunning, it was relatively easy for me to pick it up. Like it was a big learning curve, but all things considered, it took me like I think 3 months after having started soul speedrunning to be top 5 with that obsolete route on the leaderboards. So that philosophy is basically you look at the routes that exist. You go over multiple runs. Sometimes people make this mistake that they only check the world record, but especially with a game that has RNG, you check out multiple runs to be able to see the different outcomes, see how they react, the players I mean, and get into the fights, make save files, try to make practicing as efficient as possible. So like minimizing run backs, making sure you have the correct equipment so you don't have to like change things all the time, and then practice the fights. See how the runs do, try to replicate it, try to experiment in the different situations, and then if you cannot figure it out, go hunt for different VODs as well and try to find those attacks that you do not understand, for example. And this prior experimentation is, I think, very important and sometimes neglected because it allows you to understand why the players do what they do. Not just what they do, but why they do it. And then that way, in the future, once you get better, you can actually use all this knowledge to develop strategies of your own. This has happened multiple times later on in my Dark Souls speedrunning career, where I would implement new strafes on bosses or implement new punishes that no one else had really done before me because I understood how the boss worked from experimenting and observing.
That's actually a point. When do you decide to look out? So, as you mentioned, a lot of people's, when getting introduced to a speedrun, they may go, okay, first one on speedrun.com, let's have a look, let's look at the route and go through and see how well I can copy it and implement it myself. At what point do you shift away from that and decide, okay, I know they do it like this, but let's go and test this weapon or go and test this different route in? Do you do that from the start, or is it only after you've got a good grasp of a pre-existing route, perhaps?
So I think this will always depend on the runner. When it comes to me and routing in RPGs, I am more of a refiner than someone who would be dictating what is done. So I might have ideas for routes. I might try different things, but especially for Dark Souls, you need like a really deep understanding of how the routes are structured to be able to come up with something new. And I think that takes quite a bit of time to develop, at least for me. And so most of the time, I would basically look at what exists and then try to refine it, try to refine setups, try to see if there are potential time saves on what already exists rather than, going from the ground up and trying to rebuild the whole route.
Yeah.
There are definitely people that do that, and they're great. Like anytime that you have someone new come into the community and try to basically evaluate the existing routes, it gives you a new perspective within the community. And even if they might not do it themselves, they might have ideas that help others revolutionize certain routes. And that's happened before as well with Dark Souls.
Yeah, I think that that is a point to note that people listening in a speedrunning community, there is obviously the speedrunners, the people who actually run the game, but there are those also who have just a pure interest in the route or the glitch hunting or those sort of aspects, just aspects of the run, not just the running the route or the game themselves. Like it's all, as you said earlier, that the community aspect of those people, the runners, it all loops together and able to do these sub 20-minute kind of runs in Dark Souls, for example.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty much spot on, yeah.
Sort of not segue, but I want to ask about this just because it was just a curiosity point, and then we'll just carry on with like the loop we're going here. I did see on one of your videos you did an NG to NG plus 6 speed run, and I was just interested where that came from.
Oh, that's Wow. That's a long time ago. I don't remember exactly what the impetus for it was.
Mm.
I think I needed to do, or like I wanted to do a longer stream for some reason. I don't remember exactly what it was, but
Mm.
given that a regular all bosses speedrun is about, an hour long, you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, back then it was a little bit longer, but you can imagine that a new game, the new game plus 6 all bosses in Dark Souls is gonna, yeah, it's gonna be quite long. And I remember that also there was only one friend of mine who had really done that before, so I wanted to break that time.
Mm.
I don't think anyone's really tried it. I might be wrong though, but of course it's just a sort of a meme run, nothing that would be tracked. But yeah, it was just a random idea, and in the end, it was quite interesting because in New Game Plus you get to do some glitches that you don't do in New Game because
Okay.
you already have certain items in your inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, wrong warping from Hydra all the way to the start of Anolondo, skipping Sense Fortress entirely,
Mm-hmm.
even though you come back later, but still for Iron Golem that is, of course. So that made it pretty interesting. And then later on, some of the bosses were of course tankier, and so certain strats that I had didn't really work anymore
Yeah.
because I ran out of spells, right? Because you don't have FP in Dark Souls 1, you have spell casting slots, and
Yeah.
then you have a certain number of casts. So I would just run out of spells, and I'm like, oh well, I guess I'm screwed. So yeah, it was a pretty fun run, but honestly, just a random idea.
Yeah. It just caught your attention when I was looking through, and it's like, okay, 1 hour speed run, 2 hour speed run, 30-minute speed run, 10 hour speed run. So it caught attention. So we're talking about different approaches in the community of what different people do. One thing that you've done very well is, not sure what the best way to describe it as, but documenting or displaying the Dark Souls speedrunning route through your YouTube videos. Would that be a fair way to describe it, or would you put it some way different?
I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. Yeah, I was inspired by a bunch of my fellow friends and also speedrunning YouTubers that cover different games,
Mm-hmm.
and I basically thought, okay, well, Souls is it's a popular genre. It has a lot of fans, and a lot of people do not really understand the speedruns that well.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the times they do not really, because they do not understand it well, a lot of the times they're not really interested. But a lot of the stuff that happens within speedrunning, whether that is the technicalities behind the glitches, whether that is the technicalities behind just some small game quirks, like one or another character type being faster or slower, or the stories that can be told through the records that are achieved, those are sort of not observed by those people, and I think those people would like these things, and so I basically took it upon myself as someone in a relatively interesting position who has a lot of insight into the speedrunning world, not just in Souls, but in general,
Mm-hmm.
and who also has some video editing skills to try and create entertaining and hopefully informational videos as well about Souls speedruns.
So let's go on the technical side. So made several videos on different glitches, some being quite technical. So let's give the example of in Dark Souls, the wrong warp glitch. In terms of how do you approach making a video for that for, say, a layman just going in? They're interested in gaming, they've done a casual play of Dark Souls. How do you go in the scripting, or how do you go about thinking to present that information in a entertaining way?
Right. Usually, first, like I always like to make an outline, and I try to think about, okay, what is the story that I'm telling? What is it that I'm trying to convey? Like, am I trying to tell someone about how the wrong warp works, or am I trying to tell them how the wrong warp is used in a run?
Mm-hmm.
Because that will differentiate between the videos, right? That one of them needs a more technical and deeper explanation. One of them is more something that can only be basically briefly mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So I decide on the type of the video based on the information that I want to tell. And then after that, I try to understand the glitch as much as I can. Of course, this involves other community members. I always get help. I try to ask questions, but I'm also of the mindset that I try to look up things as much as possible. If there were previous Discord conversations, I read through all of them. I try to replicate all the different scenarios. I try to think about it critically.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that a little bit earlier before about the routing. I try to apply that to a glitch, for example. I try to see, okay, why is this done and not something else? Why does it work this way? And then when I have questions, I ask within the Discord. I usually get help. And then I try to distill it in such a way that can basically be told from A to Z. And then, of course, I try to come up with as many animations and graphics that can make it easier for people to understand how the glitches work,
Mm-hmm.
and also that make it just more entertaining and kind of more fun to watch.
Yeah. I also some of the edits I thought were absolutely top notch in some of the videos that I saw. I can't think of
Thank you.
a specific. Well, I can think of a couple of specific examples, but I can't remember the videos themselves because I sort of had a binge watch whilst researching for this episode. So when you see, and this can be about your own videos or perhaps other creators in the same niche, what would you class as a good documentary or storytelling style video in the speedrunning or gaming niche? Is there like a checklist or a sort of like go, okay, it has this, or a feel?
I don't think I ever really thought about it this way. I think in the end, the most interesting thing is the most important thing is the idea and the information that is being presented, right? Like if it's a groundbreaking new glitch in, I don't know, Ocarina of Time, then I think that already that idea kind of sells the video to me.
Yeah.
After that, the delivery of it, of course, it needs to be succinct. It needs to be succinct enough that people that haven't even played the game can understand it. Like I have played Ocarina of Time only very briefly, using it just as an example, but I have watched a lot of videos about its glitches because they are made in such a way that I can understand. And then all the other stuff that comes along with it, like the animations and the editing, that's a little bit like a thing that is not as important, that is like an extra layer. But sometimes it is the smallest things like this that can really differentiate a video and make it stand out. So you can usually tell when you're watching a video, you can usually tell if someone made a video. I'm not saying always, but usually you can tell if someone made a video out of passion and love for the subject, or if they made a video because they thought, oh, this is a cool idea, I want to try to capitalize it on get some clicks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's either something that they've done, as you say, for passion, or it's as a means to get quote unquote easy views. Maybe not
Yes.
to that direct or bluntness, but in that sort of some similar field.
Yeah.
But yeah, I probably should have mentioned at the very start of that, Cata has several really great videos on the technical glitches of Dark Souls and Elden Ring, and some of the speedruns as well. The 90% of both, I believe, both Elden Ring and Dark Souls. Definitely Dark Souls, because I saw the 20-minute one, which was pretty mad when I was watching it. The fact that the category is getting very competitive. There is competition to get the next level or next minute, or break the next minute or the next 10-second barrier. And one of Cata's videos, is on a video where a Dark Souls speedrunner breaks the 20 minutes barrier in Dark Souls, but then goes an extra 15 seconds below to like 20:49, which is a pretty mad breakthrough.
Yeah, sometimes these things can happen, and in Dark Souls in particular, it's quite fascinating because they keep on happening. Like I'm working on something right now that is also pretty groundbreaking. It takes a while to edit because a lot of these videos I put a lot of work into them. Yeah. So it's something that happened already at the end of last year, but it's pretty big and it just keeps happening. I don't know why, but Dark Souls 1, just the way the game is built, the community around it, the activity, there's always new stuff to pursue. There's always new stuff to discover, and it's great. And that's another reason why I love to tell these stories, because there are people like me who really like Dark Souls 1. They maybe not for the speedruns, but they really like the game and they want to get more out of it, whether that is by playing it or whether that is by learning about it. And I want to serve them these things. I want to tell them these things because I'm in the unique position to do so.
Yeah, and viewers can, or members of the community can experience the same ideas through like content that you're creating, or different formats, not just the runs themselves, which is always cool.
Yes.
It's more accessible for a wider range of people who do have the interest but may not have the interest in sitting down for a 2-hour run through of a game, perhaps.
Yes.
That's actually just crossed my mind, something you just said. With Dark Souls, there's two different categories of Dark Souls, obviously, because of the remake or remaster. Did that notably affect the speed run of the games between the two versions?
Well, they're completely separate, right? They have completely separate leaderboards.
Yep.
Funny that you ask. I have a video about that exact question as well. It's a long one. It's an old one, but it's still pretty relevant. The main differences are there are some glitch differences, and very notably, the timer ticks differently between the two different games, so you cannot directly compare the times, right? In Remaster, it takes a little bit slower, so it seems like it is faster when looking at the vanilla game. So they're just completely separate leaderboards, and you can decide whether you want to run the original Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition, or if you want to run Dark Souls Remastered. Generally, that's not always true, but generally, Prepare to Die edition will have a little bit more longevity. It has a little bit more complexity in its glitches and routes. While Dark Souls Remaster is a little bit more accessible because it has a glitch called quantity usage, which allows you to generate a huge number of souls very quickly, very early. And so for beginners, you can level a lot of vitality and then you can tank a lot of things. Might not be the fastest approach, but it's a very safe approach to finish some of the runs, especially when you're starting off.
Sorry, just to backtrack just a sec. One of them counts slower? How does that... Sorry, how does that work?
Yeah, so that's because of frame differences, right?
Okay.
30 FPS is the limit for Prepare to Die edition, while 60 FPS is the limit for Remaster. And the way that the in-game timer is coded is actually really good for speedrunning because it's incredibly consistent. Basically, any time a frame passes, it advances the in-game timer a certain number. So 1/30th of a second, for example, for Prepare to Die edition. So that means that regardless of what your frame rate is in the games, like if someone has a worse PC and they have more frame drops, they will not lose time, which is not necessarily the case in modern From Software games like Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. But because of these version differences and the different tick rates on the timers, one of them basically in real time ticks a little bit slower. So it's like I think in a minute, I might be talking out of my butt here, but I think in a minute it's like 6-second difference or something like that. But obviously, if you have a 20-minute speed run, then well, that adds up.
Let's go into categories. Was going to say something about Elden Ring, but Dark Souls. Did you have a preference towards categories? Because you did runs across the two games. I can't differentiate between which ones you did in the Prepare to Die or the remaster, but both from like the 80% all up to an all achievements run. Did you have a preference towards a certain length of run, like the shorter runs or the large runs, or all equally?
I would say that all bosses was probably always the best medium because the short runs can be really fun, but you optimize them relatively quickly. And then at that point, you're grinding for every split second. And sometimes you just get bad RNG on one random enemy and it costs you 3 seconds. And the run that was going well is not really going well anymore. And that doesn't make for super fun experience, both for me as a runner and for my audience as well.
Yep.
So all bosses usually were around 1 hour, 1 hour 5 minutes, 1 hour 20 minutes, roughly something like that. Over the years, of course, that has evolved. But that I thought was kind of the happy medium. And then the all achievements run, or even 100% run actually in Prepare to Die edition, those are a little bit longer, especially the 100% run that ended up being about 4 hours real time. And what was cool about those runs is that you got to go into areas that most of the other runs never really venture into. And that also means that there are some new skips. There's a little bit more new tech. Like I would say that if anyone wants to see the most complex run of Dark Souls, then go watch the Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition 100% speedrun. Essentially 100%, just to quickly explain, it has nothing to do with achievements. It means progressing as many permanent changes to the world as possible. So for example, if you break an illusory wall, that's a permanent change to the world, right? So you do all of that within the new game cycle. So you do the quest lines, you do all bosses, you open all the or you go through all the fog walls, you break all the illusory walls, things of that nature. You pick up all the items that are on the ground. So it's a massive run that goes into areas that you basically never really see in speedruns, like Ash Lake, for example. And there's some tech that is hidden there. So I would say the preference was somewhere in the middle. But sometimes it was fun to do shorter runs, and sometimes it was also fun to do longer runs.
Who routed that initial, like that original 100%? Because that sounds a lot of, like you complete a run and then someone pipes up, oh yeah, you missed the item in the back corner of the library or something.
Yeah, that was the legend Kamul, one of the most prolific speedrunners of Dark Souls over the years, and he's one of the rare kinds where he's not just really good at the game, but he understands it at a very deep level, and he's able to come up with fantastic routing and fantastic glitches as well. And he was the one who really spent the most time on 100%, and I think he basically built an item tracker for it. So essentially you can read the game's memory nowadays, and you can assign, or you can read the flags for each of these permanent changes, right? So of course he might have missed something at first, but overall he did come to some kind of a conclusion. And then thanks to the tracker, you can kind of keep track of your progress during the run. And I can tell you that definitely the first few runs that you do, maybe even more than if you end up with like, 99.6% or 99.8%. And then you're like, oh, which item did I miss? Or what went wrong? Oh, I forgot about this illusory wall or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I spoke to a runner named Cookie Naval a few weeks ago, who is a speedrunner of the Crash series. And I don't know if you've played Crash Bandicoot 4, but
I have not.
Okay, the devs made that game and absolutely went overboard with the number of collectibles in it. So in the original series, there's like 100 boxes max in certain levels. In Crash 4, they went up to like 500 in certain levels. And so in like the fully complete equivalent of like the 100% in Prepare to Die, 106% in Crash 4, there's the exact same thing of like, oh yeah, you just missed this tiny box that's like hidden in the side out of the 500 you've already hit. And it's just, I can imagine those are the early days of running those sorts of runs. Well, maybe not even the early days. I'd probably be in it for a good while.
Yeah.
Just picking up from what we were talking about earlier with Prince of Persia being, at least with on the glitches side, being a lot of trial and error, head against the wall kind of effort to find out what works, what doesn't. You mentioned that in Dark Souls there was a bit of being able to look at behind the scenes of the code. Was there any sort of examples you could give of how that helped for the speedrun, for any sort of glitches or on that side?
Yeah, that actually is a really good question, and I do have a pretty concrete example as well. So I have to shout out the modding community, because the mods, or the modders, I should say, are insane when it comes to Souls. They've been able to really reverse engineer a ton of the game, and it's allowed us to do some great things. It helps me with my videos as well. Like, I'm able to extract models from the games and then put them into 3D software. But I digress. The point is that we have been able to look into the games a little bit more deeply. Lot in part thanks to the modders, so shout outs to them. And in the case of Dark Souls 1, there used to be, and probably still is, a section of the run where you need to lose health on purpose. That happens quite often because you are activating the red tear stone ring, which essentially doubles or even triples your damage when you're under 20% health. And there's a part before Sif, when you're approaching the fight, where you had to use one of the knights in the forest to get hit by. And there were only specific attacks that got you into the right threshold. So let's say that the knight has 4 attacks. 3 of them would work, but 1 of them wouldn't. And then you end up with having too much HP to be under 20%, but you're not low enough to just be able to take full damage to get under that 20%. So you end up in this really bad situation where you kind of have to try to heal up to full and hope for another good attack while not getting yourself killed in the process. But looking at the code, we were able to look at the AI of that particular enemy and find out that when you are blocking while two-handed, the odds of the actions of the enemy, of the NPC, change. And it minimizes the chance of that one unwanted attack happening. So that helped tremendously. And it like lowered the chance of it being 1 in 3 where you get the bad attack to like maybe 5% or something, right? It's a very simple example, but just being able to read the code like this allowed us to understand a lot more about the game.
That's so specific. But whilst you're two-handing blocking with a shield, that's when it reduces the chance.
Yeah, it works with a weapon too, because you can block with a weapon when two-handing. But point. Yeah, you had to be. I'm pretty sure you had to be like two-handed and block basically.
I'm interested. Do you have any recommendation if someone was interested in that modding aspect? Is there any communities or sites that you'd recommend people looking at?
Yeah, if you put into Google just Souls Modding Wiki, it takes you to soulsmodding.wiki.com, which is a wiki dedicated to modding, and there you can find the links to the modding Discord server as well, and also a bunch of getting started pages which have like certain tutorials. Those have been popping up a lot more recently, I want to say over the past maybe 2 years as new tools have been developed. Like, it really depends on what you want to do with modding, but if, for example, you're just interested in working with some 3D elements, then that has become simpler than ever, really. So there are some tutorials there. There are the links to glossary and also some explanations about the shared aspects of modding between the different games, because a lot of the engine is shared between all the Souls games and Elden Ring, basically going back to Demon Souls. So, yeah.
I'm just getting flashbacks to like Nightreign now, where like all the enemies are appearing the same one, and just wondering how easy that must have been to just drop them in. Imagine they had to change them slightly for obviously the Elden Ring stuff, but it's the exact same one, so it can't have been too. Have you played it at all? Was you in the network test or receive a
Yeah,
key?
I had the chance to play it. Yeah, it was
Joy?
fun. It was fun. Obviously, quite limited in content, I think, but I think it's gonna be a lot of fun when you get to group up with friends and have comms and just kind of chill on in a voice call. I think it's gonna be good. There
Yeah.
were definitely some disappointing aspects when it comes to Centipede Demon, who was in the network test. I was really excited. I was like, okay, they're gonna bring these old bosses up to speed to the modern From Software combat, and then the dude was like literally the same as Dark Souls 1, which is crazy, right? Because Dark Souls 1 is so much slower
Slower,
combat wise.
yeah.
It's a completely different game, so that was a little disappointing, but I think they'll cook up something good for the final release.
Yeah, I'm just dream of the game would be something that they could just randomly update each year, and because it's a non-canon world, they could just go crazy with it, like just have random maps from other games, like a Ring City map, or just drop some DS2 DLC bosses in there, and just they can just have that game to update when they want and just go mad with. That's the sort of what I would like the game to be. I doubt it'll be anything like that, but just thinking they've got a chance, like they could do what they want with it.
Yeah, they definitely could, and the engine would allow it probably.
But yeah, we'll cross fingers. Something I was curious about in some of your videos, like the B-roll of like bosses frozen. Is that on the modding aspect, or is that a different way to in order to get those? As I should explain. So in some of Cata's videos, whilst stuff's being explained, there is showing of bosses or areas where bosses can be mid-swing or frozen. Let's just give a visual, and was just wondering how you get those sorts of like B-roll.
Yeah, that comes back definitely to the modding. I mean, I do all of my editing myself, so all of the shots and everything that you see in the videos, that's my work. But so one time, long time ago, on Steam there was an update for Dark Souls, and they accidentally pushed the debug exe of the game.
Okay.
And even though they removed it like almost immediately, obviously people got
Yeah, it
it.
doesn't
People
matter.
backed
It's
it up.
like
Yeah,
100 downloads
it's
already.
there.
Yeah.
Exactly, it's there. And so then over the years, people have been able to, well, in Dark Souls 1, it already worked pretty well, but they have been able to reverse engineer the other games as well, creating cheat engine tables and sometimes even recreating debug as well for something like Dark Souls 3. So for Dark Souls 1, I have access to the debug menu. Most of it works, and the free camera that they used as well, which allows you to freeze the game. Or through debug, you can also just freeze individual enemies, for example. Most of that works, and the free cam was also restored by the modders. So that's how a lot of the Dark Souls 1 shots happen. Also, Dark Souls 3 shots happen the same way. Dark Souls 2 is a little bit different. That's built on a slightly different engine. Doesn't really use the debug, but there are some other practice tools and other things of such nature as well that have allowed me to freeze enemies potentially, like break their AI, and then they stay in place. And for Elden Ring, it's also you have access to a free cam that was done by the modders, but you also have access to some other tools which are a little bit more complex, that give you even access to like camera paths and stuff like that.
It's interesting speaking to people who have access or do these kinds of things, or modders, or I've spoken to a task creator previously, that you go from getting a game, putting the disc in, or, well, not the disc nowadays because everything's digital, but you know what I mean, from going just casually playing a game to just seeing what people can do with just like a computer and plugging in, and can completely see what they want or edit what they want or create what they want in these pre-existing things that come out. Normally what seems to be uneditable. There's a better way to say that, but I'm not sure at the moment. But then they're able to do stuff like this, like modders and people who are in that sort of industry.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And honestly, for a lot of these games, in terms of Souls games, it adds so much more longevity. Like over the past, what's it now, like year and a half, I've mostly been doing randomizers because they're just super, super fun, and they give so much variety to the games. And that's all thanks to the modders. If it wasn't for the people that understand how to mod these things, we wouldn't have such great tools as players.
How has the gone into randomizer? Because going on the stream following, and so I can see like the 207 deathless or perm or co-op randomizer. What do you say the main appeal for randomizers that people who may not have tried it should be aware of?
Well, the main appeal is that you get to really test your skills in a new environment. Like, if you've gone through the game with the tools that you know and fighting the bosses that you know where they are and you can prepare yourself for them, doing a randomizer always puts you in a new situation. It gives you different gear every time. Of course, you can customize it a ton, but most of the time it gives you new gear. It gives you different tools that maybe you haven't really used before or you're not as familiar with. It puts bosses into different places. It puts enemies into different places. And it oftentimes forces you to fight a boss in a new environment. And by which I mean you have less damage, they have more HP maybe, and it really forces you to learn the boss as well. If you want to try to do, for example, some deathless runs or something like that, you probably don't want to start with it, but it just adds so much variety, especially with Elden Ring that has so many different assets, right? Like so many bosses, so many different enemies, so many different areas, and it really spices things up because no run is the same.
Definitely, and that's just the bosses, and then obviously when you throw in the item randomizer as well, where you're seeing all these weapons, because on a casual playthrough, or even if you're doing repeat runs, you can tend to drift towards the overpowered build, like getting the blasphemous blade for like a casual player, like getting that over and over again. But then that's not going to be in the same place. You got to experiment and you find out, oh, these claws are actually pretty sick, and you get to experience a lot more of the game.
Exactly.
I guess I go back to speedrunning a bit. I was interested looking on Elden Ring on your profile that, correct me if I'm wrong, but you only done all remembrance runs?
Yeah, that's correct. I did a little bit of dabbling with all achievements glitchless, but never really submitted anything because I basically never did a full run of it, but I did end up routing that run as well. But I mostly stuck with all remembrances because that was, again, that sweet spot that we kind of talked about where any percent was just a little bit too short. It wasn't really as much fun. While all remembrances had a lot more content to give. In Elden Ring, the speedrun has a big problem, and that problem is how open the game is. So you get to do tons of setting up. Anyone that's done any or watched any kind of challenge runs in Elden Ring will know this. There's tons of setup that you can do. There's tons of power that you can gain without even really fighting anything. Meanwhile, in Dark Souls, that's very different. Every time you need to progress in the map or get some new gear, you basically have to go through some bosses. So you power your character up as you're progressing through the game. But in Elden Ring, you can kind of postpone that and then come back later when you're much stronger into the early game areas. And so that is a little bit of an issue. And if you're running something like any percent where you basically just finish the game as fast as possible, you do this like 20, 25, 30 minute setup, and then you have like maybe 30 minutes of gameplay. But if you do something like All Remembrances, and mind you, this is pre-DLC, DLC obviously added a bunch. I have not done runs of that, but you do 20, 30 minutes of setup, but then you fight for a lot longer. Like you use that setup for a lot more gameplay. And so that's why I stuck with that category in particular.
And for you listening, that's not just all remembrances, although I think the best place to start that would be, Cata, could you explain what the difference is between glitchless, restricted, and unrestricted, if possibly?
Yeah, so absolutely. So these are, I'm happy that you bring that up because these are relatively new changes to the leaderboards. We really thought about them a lot and implemented them basically after the DLC had released. Due to these issues with setup and some other things as well, the way some of the glitches are like way too strong, it's always been a little bit difficult to really define super fun categories while also not trying to be like extremely arbitrary, right? Like you want to have a rule set that kind of makes sense and that doesn't have to address every single individual thing, but rather you want to have some more broader guidelines. And so what we've come up with is we have this system now of categories and subcategories. While categories will define the goal of the run, so for example, any percent, or all remembrances, or all achievements. So you're defining what you're trying to do in the run. Subcategories, on the other hand, will then define the rule sets that you have to abide by when it comes to glitches. And so you've got, as you pointed out, unrestricted, restricted, and glitchless. And of course, there are also zips that are done on the pre-DLC patches because they do not work on the DLC patches, but that is just like its own thing entirely, and not many people do that. So unrestricted essentially means exactly what it says. It means that you can do anything that you want. Besides the zips. It means you can use any glitch that you want. It means that you can use just any tool at your disposal within the game. So everything is okay. Yeah, exactly. Restricted, on the other hand, bans mainly two important glitches. One of them is a deload kill. That means that if you make an enemy fall under the map or just make them fall for 12 seconds or longer, they will automatically die to a kill timer. And that is possible to do with certain deload strategies, like you deload the ground under them, basically, they start falling. And that essentially means you're not really fighting the boss. It's not possible for all bosses, but when it's possible, it is generally less fun than just playing the game and fighting the boss. So restricted, this allows that. And on top of that, it also disallows the chainsaw glitch, very popular, or also called pizza swap sometimes.
So, sorry, Cata, could I just pause you before we go into pizza, because I do want to talk a little bit about that, but I just want to go back to that deload just a sec. Which bosses in like the route would that affect? The only ones I can think of, for example, are bosses that I wouldn't consider being in the way. Like I've seen that happen with like Grail in Dragon Barrow. I've seen like the dragon being caught on the tree, continuously fall, and eventually he just dies. In a actual speedrun route, which bosses would that be used on?
So this could be used in quite a few bosses, actually. You would be surprised, because there are multiple ways to get a little bit further away from the map. So, for example, the Legacy's glitch, which allows you to kind of just disregard gravity for certain periods of time. And then using Ashes of War, such as Bat Slam, you can actually just start falling under the map without dying, right? Like the kill timer is not going to apply to you. And so when you fall far enough at that point, anything above you is pretty much going to deload map-wise, and then the boss is going to start falling. So you could do it potentially, for example, Morgoth, right? That's pretty much always a mandatory boss. You are able to deload him. You are able to deload Horaloo. You are able to deload Radagon. You are able to deload even Elden Beast. Okay. So it applies to tons of bosses potentially. And people generally, like in Unrestricted, if that's the fastest way to go, you can do that. But most people are not going to enjoy that kind of gameplay.
Yeah.
So that's why the restricted category exists. And we will get into the other glitch that I mentioned, but that one also disrupts this classic gameplay of fighting bosses a lot. So it is not allowed in restricted. Yeah. Other than that, like wrong warps, if they exist on that patch, on that version of the game, you can do them. Any kind of other glitch like ladder storage, all of that is fair play. So essentially, unrestricted, anything goes. Restricted, the most overpowered glitches that take over an entire run are banned. And then glitchless, basically, bans all the glitches. There are some exceptions, of course, because there always are. Like, what even is a glitch? What isn't a glitch? That's
what the developers intend.
Yeah, exactly. It's a never-ending debate. But for the most part, glitchless just means that you are not using any glitches that you can think of.
So that's the extra explanation on the deloading. The other one, which I interrupted slightly, was the pizza swap or the chainsaw glitch, which could you explain, especially with the fact of why it's called pizza swap in Elden Ring?
Yeah, definitely. So it's essentially a glitch that allows you to transfer a stance from one weapon that has it to a weapon that does not have it. And there are multiple ways of activating it, depending on which version of the game you have and which version of the game you are running on. But essentially, the outcome is that the game is then going to default what we presume is the first stance on the game's internal list, which somehow turns out to be the Giza's Wheel. And so you basically end up with this stance that is hitting repeatedly, right? That's what the Giza's Wheel Ash of War does. And when you apply this to certain weapons that have large AoEs, and when you apply it to, especially importantly, to the Serpent Hunter, you end up getting the massive Serpent Hunter hitbox that is normally only present in Rykard's fight. Because the game essentially like tries to go to the default state of the weapon, and that's the default state of the weapon. So what ends up happening is you're holding this weapon in front of you like almost a gun, and you have massive range, obviously massive damage per tick, and you're hitting repeatedly with your R1 damage, like very, very quickly. It goes even through walls, goes through everything. So if you haven't seen it, I also have videos about it. It's quite a sight to see. But it's one of those things that can get pretty old because you basically use it the same way on every single boss fight. And as for why it is called the pizza swap, that is because, well, you're swapping the stance, of course, but the pizza comes from Bloodborne, where the pizza cutter was first introduced as a weapon I think in one of the DLCs. And so it was called the pizza cutter, and the Giza's Wheel is essentially some kind of a successor to it. And so that's why we called it pizza swap.
Yeah, the wheel looks very well. The outline of the weapon looks very similar. The weapon itself doesn't look that similar to the whirligig in Bloodborne, if people remember that from the DLC, and pretty much similar moveset, which is what Cata was saying in like the repeating attack stance. I think we've sort of touched on already, but just going a little bit more into that aspect of how a community goes or approaches a discovered skip or approach that does improve a run, but also may make the run itself less fun to experiment with. So something like that, which does, having seen the videos, does just clear through any sort of boss. Rykard, million health, Fair Giant, million health, just goes down in seconds, or a little bit longer than that, but goes down very quickly. But obviously that makes the run itself, to me at least, would be quite stale. Is that something that has had to be combated? Again, is this probably something to do with the splitting of subcategories for the run?
Yeah, you're pretty much spot on there. That's usually what you try to address. I think the way I look at it, as part of the moderation team, as someone who's been in these discussions a lot over the years, I think of the different runs as basically philosophies, right? Like you can have and I have a good example for this actually from way back when we talked about Prince of Persia. In those games, you have the any percent category, where basically, again, anything goes, and the entire game is dominated by zips, where you basically zip from one load trigger to another. There's some kind of an appeal to it, sure, but it kind of gets stale. Then you have the zipless runs, where you basically allow all other glitches besides zips, because the games are usually really, really broken still, and they have tons of different glitches to show, and a lot of different variety of strategies to show throughout the run. However, at its core, Prince of Persia games are platformers, so a lot of those glitches also kill a lot of the platforming because you deal with things like airwalk and other stuff. And so then you also have the no major glitches categories where the platforming and the smooth movement, right? Like optimizing your jumps and everything that comes with it, that's where it comes into play. And some of the small glitches are allowed because they mostly manipulate movement, like being on a beam and then being able to, using a glitch, you are able to aim where you're normally not supposed to aim. And then that way you can maybe skip like a parkour section or something like that. So when looking at categories, I always like to think about it as different philosophies of the run. And then when you define something like a glitchless category and something new comes up, right? There's a new discovery that is kind of borderline. Is this a glitch? Is this not a glitch? Think about, does this fit the philosophy of the run? Does it take away from what we're trying to create here, or does it actually not? And then in that framework, you decide to either ban it from that category or delegate it to its own category, or try to brainstorm some other solution as well, potentially.
So just asking for for someone who is in those meetings or been in those discussions, how do you avoid? Again, this is coming from a layman's view of seeing these runs from an outside perspective, or someone who does the runs not in the moderation side. How do you avoid going into the million category aspect? Okay, this one's sort of on the border, so we'll just make a category for that, or this or that. How do you avoid that aspect?
Yeah, it can become difficult, and there are certain game series like Resident Evil which I think have not been able to do that, and their leaderboards are usually a mess. Sorry for calling you out, RE gamers, but you know it firsthand, okay? But it all depends always on the game, and if you think that something should be delegated to its own category, there's always also the question of like, is there even gonna be people running it? Are there gonna be people running it? If you get like one or two people doing one run in 3 years, I don't think that necessarily warrants having a category on the leaderboard, right? Trying to clutter it. So that is something to kind of think about as well. Like, is this what we're creating? Is this something that people want? And is this something that people will want for quite some time? Dark Souls has been able to avoid that generally, like the big split categorization, because of the nature of the game, and also because of how, for example, how much, I don't want to say disdain, but uninterest there was for something like Glitchless in Prepare to Die Edition. Because most people running Prepare to Die Edition ran it for the glitches. So they didn't care about a glitchless category. And then even trying to like define a glitchless rule set basically didn't have to be done until only a couple of years ago.
We just said there's made me think of like the term moderator has to be like it is moderation. You guys aren't referees, and what I mean by that is it's not just about making sure that a name and a number goes correctly on a board. It's about the fact that it is community based, and you've got to make sure that it's best in terms of fostering a decent environment, as it were. You may I think you may want to put that a bit differently, but I'm just thinking about that aspect, or that difference between being a moderator or being a referee, or just someone whose job is to check times and make sure that they haven't cheated.
Yeah, no, this is an important distinction for sure. So, and it's good that you bring it up, because yeah, sure. Like one of the things that we do is we verify the runs, right? So that's what you say when you say referee. I like to think of it as a verifier,
Yeah,
and
yeah, that
that's
works
one
well.
aspect. But basically, we are sort of volunteers and also voluntary representatives of the community. So, like, if the community doesn't want to run a certain category or doesn't like this rule set and is just not gonna run a category with a certain move set, well, then we represent that community, and so that means we should try and change that rule set to make it appealing based on the feedback. Like essentially what moderation teams are supposed to do in my eyes is you are just the one who's kind of managing the leaderboard, managing the categories, but you don't make the decisions on your own, right? Like you are representing other people. And so you need to communicate with those people, and people need to be able to express their opinions openly and have conversations between the mods team who represents them and also between all the different members of the community. So you cannot imagine it that it's like for the people that maybe are not as familiar with speedrunning, it's not that there are a couple of moderators that grab power and then they decide what, is run and what isn't run. No, like as a runner, you can run whatever you want. You don't have to abide by any of these rules. Like you can do a glitchless run and then do a wrong warp. You just cannot submit it to that leaderboard because you wouldn't be competing fairly with those people. But if that's the fun run that you enjoy doing, you can do it. And if there's going to be enough people that enjoy doing the same run that you do, well, then maybe there's a case to just have a leaderboard and track it. And at that point, you create a new category or something like that.
I want to go into, we've already gone touched on it here and there in streaming, on the acts of streaming, and I don't know, we talked about 2012, 2013, the years around be starting speedrunning. I don't know if you started streaming that early as well. Was it around that time or was it a bit later on?
Oh, that was mostly later on. I mean, if you don't count me streaming a couple league games back in 2013, I think like I basically started streaming just so I didn't have to record my attempts back in 2015, just so I, was able to export them or highlight them on Twitch.
Yep.
And then submit them. And then I started looking more into streaming, I think about halfway through 2017. And so I basically got more into it, got some slightly better equipment to actually sound all right on stream rather than using a headset mic and stuff. And I didn't really think about it as a business or anything like that, but I also did think about, okay, well, if I keep on running Prince of Persia games, that is fun and all, but in the end, not enough people really care. And so I started looking into other games that I could run as well. And I found some success with Last of Us, like I said, and then got more into it with Dark Souls. And it just kind of grew from there. Like I didn't think about it too much. I just kept on doing my own thing and trying to improve as an entertainer. And basically just went from there.
I want to touch back on streaming just because you have done it for such a length of time. I was interested if there's anything that you've seen change in 8 years in like the platform in itself or just streaming in general.
I feel like that's a pretty complex topic that we're probably not going to have enough time to kind of go into here.
True.
But I definitely have. So also connecting into speedrunning, I think I have one interesting insight. A lot of times I have seen people back from when I was a very active speedrunner, right? Just really pursuing world records and grinding it out. You would see people who used to be world record level speedrunners who would grow a following kind of fall out of that. And I always wondered if why that is for, what's the reason for that happening. And in the end, it comes down to the fact that people like to watch videos and content about speedruns more than the speedruns themselves, because it is more distilled, it is more curated, it is better produced, and a lot of the times, if you're speedrunning, most of your attempts, like, they don't really go anywhere, right? Like, you just reset. And so at that point, you spend 5, 6, 8 hours a day doing attempts. And at the end of the day, you're kind of left with nothing. You basically made no mark. Like, you entertained people, of course, but then as soon as the stream ends, that's it, right? Until you stream the next time.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is that these top-tier speedrunners, when they actually try to pursue a career in this, they go a lot more into challenge runs. And I always wondered, like, why? And is it really something necessary? Because I usually found it pretty easy to play really, really well while also talking to chat and stuff like that. And really, like, the important thing is that with challenge runs and just coming up with different ideas for the game, where you can use your skill that you've developed as a speedrunner, it will be a lot more presentable later on. So when you do a run of something, let's say a randomizer run or something like that, well, you entertain people while you do it, but then you also get more content out of it later, and you get to entertain people on YouTube as well and actually leave a mark.
Yep.
So I think that is sort of something to watch, that if you see prolific speedrunners in terms of how good they are at a game, and if they try to pursue a career further in whether that is streaming or YouTube or presumably both, you will probably notice them kind of diverging away from speedruns. Still content where they use their skill and maybe have a timer, but it is not going to be the same kind of world record grind. It's very difficult to keep up with that, with all the new strategies, while also trying to pursue this as a job.
Yeah, I think that what you were just saying there touches a lot on when we were talking about video production earlier, to do with if you watch through a run, even if the speedrunner is very descriptive or focused on describing what they're doing as they're going through a run, at the same time the majority of their focus is going to be on making sure that they're doing, especially in a speed run where obviously every second matters, the majority of their focus is on make sure they can do this run well and get a best time, as opposed to in the video creation of a story-based video on that speed run, the focus is on making that speed run accessible, those techniques, those glitches being explained and accessible to a new audience, or potentially people who've already seen it but are able to then understand it. So there's different approaches. One's obviously the entertainment aspect of you're watching a speedrun done live, and if it's a solid run, then there's the hype and all that engagement of it. And then of the YouTube videos, of which is the focus is to explain, okay, I'm losing my words here, but I think you get the grasp of what I'm going with.
No, definitely, yeah. And there's a little bit, like you talked about evolution. I think there's a little bit of an evolution here as well to observe. Some time ago, what became pretty popular to do was to post commentate your runs, right? But then if you do the same run, if you improve your record in the same category, like doing post commentary for everything is kind of like, it's pretty redundant. People don't want to watch the same run that's done 15 seconds faster without any major changes. So you would basically grind for a while, get a decent record, then you would do post commentary, and that run would do well on YouTube usually. So obviously also the popularity of marathon runs many years ago was way higher, because people didn't really have anything else that they could watch speedrun wise. But then it has developed more into like, okay, well, if you're doing post commentary for your run, why don't you also cut out the boring sections and produce it in a better way and make some cool graphics? And well, that's kind of where we are now, where a lot of people cover speedrunning from that aspect, right? Create a story, as you said, and also add some extra elements to it as well. But doing all of that while also being like top level speedrunner is just incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only a novice in video editing for these sorts of runs, and holy, the time investment in terms of trying to improve your skill set and to do the actual videos themselves is so much more than maybe apparent from the length of the videos.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild.
Sticking along the streaming, I've seen you have taken part in quite a few events. We'll go with the speedrunning first, so GDQ, ESA, and you've been there for years, isn't it? So the earliest one I've seen is 19, but that might just be the ones I could find. But so that's 6 years already.
Yeah. The first ESA that I had gone to was in 2018. GDQ was 2019, and then 2022. Of course, being European, it's a lot more difficult to go overseas to GDQ. So I've only done that twice, but got to have a really popular Dark Souls run back in 2019, and then got to close off the marathon in 2022 with Elden Ring. So from that standpoint, with GDQ, I feel like I've kind of achieved what I've always wanted. You know, ever since basically 10 years prior in 2012, I saw Mike Uyama running Prince of Persia, and then I got to close his marathon essentially a decade later. That was really, really cool. And my first on-site marathon was in 2017. That was in Germany. It was a much smaller event as well. But besides being able to contribute to these charitable causes, it's just so cool to be able to meet the people that you've been talking to for years online and you've developed relationships with, right? And so now basically, like I said, I have friends that I have known for years. And even though we're scattered all over Europe, these marathons end up being the places where we can always gather and have a lot of fun.
Imagine the one in Germany was much more accessible than the one in for GDQ.
Yeah.
How is the experience of going from doing something you do potentially every day, like learning the run, improving the run, and streaming it? You get the sort of comfort level of being able to do that every day. How do you find the difference, I guess, with nerves or playing to that level as well, whilst there's a massive crowd behind you, potentially commentators as well?
I personally never really had issues with it because the more and more you do something, the more and more you can kind of put it on autopilot, right?
Yeah.
So people always complimented me on how much I can interact with chat when I stream. And that's because I was just able to like really nail down the gameplay. And then I was able to focus on the chat a lot more.
Yep.
And so I basically carry that over to my marathon performances as well, that I'm able to talk and explain relatively eloquently, I would say, while also maintaining pretty high level of gameplay.
Yep.
At the same time, also being someone who doesn't really get nervous in front of people, that obviously helps. And that usually makes for a decent showcase. I think for anyone that wants to run at a marathon or that has done some runs and gets nervous, always remember that at a marathon, it's never about perfect gameplay. It's never about not making any mistakes. It's about making it fun, making it accessible. Most of the time, people that are watching you run, they don't even know the game that well. Or if they do not know the speedrun that well. So unless you point out to them that you made a mistake that just cost you 3 seconds, they're not going to really notice, right?
Yeah.
So just don't talk about it or only, gloss over it and just try to make it as entertaining as possible rather than trying to make like the sickest run that you can.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice. Along the similar lines, in terms of events, although this one, going a bit brave from speedrunning, also took part in both Domo and Forces events, the Deathless Randomizer League and the Bingo Brawlers. How is the approach for learning specific challenge events? Okay, I should explain. So the Deathless Randomizer League was a league put on by Forza, another challenge streamer, speedrunner, who put on a league of seeing what people could do in 2 hours in a randomized Elden Ring seed, and if they could beat as many bosses as possible. And Kaz and Domo put on a competitive Elden Ring bingo, players playing against each other, getting a set of 25 objectives and seeing who could get the best runs. I'm explaining it a bit quickly, but just that is the general gist of both. And interested in your approach to those events, because they're both competitive events, of course.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, probably. So DRL is a little bit simpler, the Deathless Rando League.
Yeah.
Essentially, it comes down to, in that league, it comes down to routing a lot, knowing which kind of bosses to go for, right? Because you know which locations you want to go to. You don't know which boss is going to be there, but you know what the locations are. And then you essentially need to know your movesets, know the weapons well enough. It comes down to general knowledge and knowing the boss fights well enough. And a lot of it for DRL comes from Bingo Brawlers, because before I was invited to season 2 of Bingo Brawlers that I participated in, and then season 3 subsequently, I was mostly doing the speedruns in Elden Ring. And coming back to what I said a while ago, when you're learning a speedrun, you know really well how to do the strats in the speedrun.
Yep.
But as soon as you're put into a different setting with different weapons against different bosses with different stats, it is nightmare. And I had to go from the ground up. There were so many things to learn. Not just to learn like what the squares, the objectives even mean, where they are, but I had to go boss by boss, basically every single day for hours when I was practicing for the competition and during it as well, and practice the movesets, really get them down. And not just consistently, but really quickly, right? Because consistency is the number one thing that you need when you're doing something like bingo. Because without consistency, you cannot really execute your tactical plans. What's important to note is that bingo brawlers, or bingo in general, because bingo brawlers is not the only gaming bingo competition. For example, Zelda games have a lot of bingo, Minecraft as well. Usually what happens is that once you claim a square, your opponent cannot claim that square anymore. And so that means, unlike in speedrunning, which you can think more of like rally or something, where you're kind of racing on a lap, but everyone races on their own turf, this is one of the rare environments where you get to interact between the players, right? It's like doing a live race, and you have the player almost proverbially in your game. And so that means not only do you have to be consistent to be able to do the strats that you want tactically, but you need to be faster than your opponent. And so basically from the ground up, I had to think of like, okay, what are the most important bosses, right? Like for example, in the early game, what are the races that you're gonna go for? Like if there's Margit 6 parries or 4 parries, if there's killing a Gil with a +0 weapon, if there's killing, I don't know, a boss with only consumables. Okay, these are all early game objectives. You need to be able to do them consistently and quickly. And so then I would boot up Margit and I would learn the moveset like really, really well. Then I would go through different weapons. Then I would go through some of the meta weapons, like weapons with square off or Uchigatana, and try to optimize them as much as possible. And if that sounds like a lot of work, well, it was. And I did it for basically every single boss fight that you would kind of encounter within these leagues and try to really nail them down. And well, in Bingo, you know, it bore fruits. I won season 2. We ended up winning season 3 with Papery as well. So back to back there. And in general, it's very, very fun because it's so unique. It's such a unique environment to be in. But at the same time, it is very taxing. Like basically when Bingo was happening, I was not doing anything else besides that. Like I went to the gym maybe, and then I just practiced and I streamed practice matches, and then I participated in the league and rinse and repeat, like for 8 to 10 hours a day, maybe sometimes even longer. So it's a lot of fun, but really this competitive mindset that I have from speedrunning kind of carried over, and I really wanted to do my best, and that also taxed me mentally a lot. So but a lot of different projects just on the sideline, and then, you know, you start feeling down because they haven't really moved on and everything. But that's more like a personal experience. But when it comes to approaching these events, basically trying to, as optimally as possible, approaching it from the most important boss fights and strategies, because it's not just boss fights, to the least important ones, right? So by the time we got to the end of the season, I was optimizing like the smallest things that weren't as important. But of course, the other competitors were doing the same stuff. So then having that extra optimization in one of the niche scenarios could win you the game and then win the league.
Yeah, I can tiny part attest to like the amount of work that must go into these, because I've recently just started learning some of the bingo just from like the amateur club that has sprung up in the last year, just to try it, just to learn it. And when you go from doing some any percent challenges, even like weapon type challenges of the base game, and then you go to something like bingo with objectives which really test how much you actually know of the game in basic stuff. So like on like the first board that I was just like learning some objectives off, it was like kill 2 symmetry shades, just really simple stuff. And I'm like, I've got no idea where the second one is, or just collect this XYZ item. I'm like, I remember using this, but where the heck in the map is that? And then that's not even going into, once you've learned those objectives, to then timing them between other objectives, tying them to other objectives, and what's the best way to do that. And then that's ignoring the competitive aspect of, okay, you've got these 3 objectives that work well together, but then you've got to keep in mind what your opponent's doing. So I'm getting a much better understanding, still only a very small understanding, but of how much is involved in that competitive level when it's finally displayed on the Brawler stream.
Yeah, it's insane, and I do appreciate this insight that you have. And I started basically in the same place. Like I didn't know most of the objectives or where they are. Like, oh, collect paintings. Like, okay, I don't remember where these are.
There's paintings
or
in
like,
the game, is there?
yeah, exactly. And they're like, what is the meta for them, right? And then so you learn individual objectives at first, then you try to optimize them, and then at some point you also get into the routing. You start trying to think of like, oh, is this approach faster? Is this pathing faster? If you're rushing to catacombs, is it faster to do this one and this one? Or if you are at this point of the map, is it faster to do a different one instead? Does your opponent know which one is faster? and stuff like that, right? Is it gonna take them 5 minutes or 4 minutes? If they've clicked this square, that's the information you get. Does that mean that they rushed it, or have they done something else in between? Like, have they set up their map or something? It's crazy. It's very, very complex. And thinking back at it, I honestly don't even know how I managed to do all of it, but I think it's probably just like in speedrunning, it's step by step. You get better at each individual strategy, you hone it down, you get better at each individual boss, you hone it down, and then you keep on going until the end is there.
Definitely. Right, Cata, I think we'll do some quick questions to finish, and then we shall wrap it up for today.
Sounds great.
So, if you had one piece of advice for someone new to speedrunning, what would that be?
engage with the community. Check out the runs. Don't just watch the world records. Try to learn on your own, not because you should be suffering, right? Like you shouldn't be figuring everything out on your own, but it will help you understand why things are done the way they are. And then when you have questions, ask the community. Trust me that speedrunners are some of the most welcoming people because it is still a very niche hobby for most of the game. Not all games are like Souls games. A lot of games will have 10 or less members in the community, sometimes even 5, but the members are always very excited to teach you about their game, and they're excited about the proposition of having another community member.
Can definitely attest to that. Several communities that I'm part of, rather whether briefly or more in depth, and everyone's passionate about seeing someone else passionate about something they're passionate about. If that makes... Yeah. If one game could be released tomorrow, either a sequel or an announced game, or maybe even unannounced or a remake that you've always wished for or would want to come out, what game would that be?
I know these are quick questions, but I need to think about this for a second.
No worries.
You know, I've got 2 answers. First, it would be nice to finally get that Prince of Persia remake that's been cooked up for like what feels like a century at this point, even though it's probably in some pre-production hell somewhere. So that would be kind of fun. And my second answer is I would love to see finished Dark Souls 1 because there are areas in the game very clearly where they ran out of time. For example, Isolith, right? Well known. Yeah, it would be fantastic to see what they actually had in mind for the game and maybe even see what they would do with the tech that they have developed since then. So something like that.
I'm just imagining they come out this brand new shiny remake of Dark Souls. You get into there, you go into Anor Londo, and they've still left Glitchless in there. just cause.
All intended.
Did you try I've not tried it myself, but someone recommended it to me, the recent Prince of Persia. I can't remember what the name of it, but it came out mid last year, I think it was.
Yeah, it's called Lost Crown.
Yeah.
It's a Metroidvania style game, so very different. I tried it, but it's mostly like it's Prince of Persia in the name. It's a great game though. It's a great game. It's a really good Metroidvania if that's your style.
If you could recommend one game for its soundtrack, which game would it be?
Nier Automata.
Nice one.
Yeah, great soundtrack. Has tracks in both English and Japanese if you're a little weebish.
Yeah, I've listened to that a couple of times. It's a solid one. If you can think of one, what would be your most hyped or fond memory on stream?
Oh, there are way too many to note them down. I think one of the proudest achievements, I guess, that I have is doing so well in Bingo Brawlers. I think that was a big highlight because of the amount of work that I put in. So being able to, share the victory with my chat and live on stream twice. That was great.
I should probably think of a better name for these. I mean, they are quick answer questions, but I guess they're not light questions.
Yeah, quick questions. I think of like, pizza or sandwiches or something like that. And I'm like, all right, it's gonna be fun. And then you're like, what is the game that you want to see released tomorrow?
Super
like,
deep like question.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll finish off by saying, what are the future plans of Catalystz?
Yeah, I'm kind of figuring things out still. I think my main plan, the way things are, is obviously I want to keep on working on my YouTube channel. I'm producing something right now, but these high production videos, they're super fun to make, but they take a long time. So I'm looking into bringing on more people to a potential team and helping me create some other content as well. And so the future plan really is to focus on that. And then, of course, just to have fun, play some Elden Ring, play some Nightreign when it comes out, and really keep working hard and kind of set things on track this year.
And if people wanted to check you out, where would they be looking?
Well, that would be Catalystz Z. That's Catalystz and then Z at the end on both YouTube and Twitch. Catalystz Z _ on Twitter or Instagram. It's mostly the YouTube and the Twitch. I'd be really happy to see you there. Go check out some of the videos. I think if you like Souls, if you like Elden Ring, and if you want to know a little bit more about what happens in speedruns and glitches, and even some, watch some challenge runs, then check it out. I think you'll like it.
And of course, links will be in whichever platform you'll be listening to in the description. Quick one before we finish, because it just crossed my mind. Where did the Catalystz name from? Because I originally thought it was because of Dark Souls, but the name predates Dark Souls by a good while. So where did the name originate?
So I have a cool story, and then I have a true story.
Okay.
So the cool story is that when I started speedrunning Well, what does Catalystz do? Catalystz makes things faster, so
Mhm.
it's the perfect fits.
Nice.
But in reality, this goes back to like Counter-Strike Source days in 2008 or something. And I
Mhm.
just needed a new nickname because I was like, all right, I'm playing a new game because I used to be a Call of Duty main back then. And I started playing Counter-Strike Source and I needed a new nickname. And I was like, what sounds cool? Catalystz. Sure, let's go with that. And that's basically where it began.
Fair play. I think we've all done that in some way. But yeah, I appreciate taking the time out for this, Cat. I've had a great time going through this conversation. I hope you have as well, man.
Yeah, Lokai, it was super fun. You've done a great job hosting, really cool questions, and I could tell that you really did your research as well, like looking into the stuff that I have done and looking into the speedrunning community a little bit more. So it was super fun. I always enjoy talking to people who do their research like this. So it was a pleasure.
I appreciate it. It's really fun looking at doing the research, learning about all these different factors. So I appreciate saying that. And I hope everyone listening has enjoyed this conversation as well, enjoyed this entire journey through it. And I hope everyone who is listening has a great rest of your day, evening, or morning, depending on when you are listening. And we'll see you for the next episode. If you enjoyed that conversation and want to hear more with amazing guests, be sure to head over to youtube.com/@nohitpodcast or wayofloci.com/nohitpodcast